Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision,
Oh,
right?
for sure. It's like engineering.
Exactly. You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is.
Right. Broken or not broken, it's completely clean.
Yeah, you can see it with your own eyes.
Yeah.
And there is an immediate, obvious path to fixing it. You put a cast on it, keep it immobilized, and just let it heal.
And it's comforting, honestly. We naturally gravitate toward things that are visible.
Right, things that can be easily categorized.
Exactly. I mean, we want the world to present us with simple, solvable problems where the cause and effect are neatly tied together.
But then, you step into the world of global economic development, and suddenly that X-ray machine is, well, it's completely useless.
Totally useless. Yeah.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. It's incredibly complex. It's constantly shifting beneath our feet. And I guess the cure for poverty or stagnation is never as simple as putting a plaster cast on a single broken system.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
Because you aren't just looking at one isolated bore, you're looking at the entire sprawling anatomy of a nation.
Right.
You're dealing with millions of individual human lives, competing institutional systems, centuries of historical baggage, and future trajectories that are, frankly, completely unpredictable.
All interacting at the exact same moment.
Exactly.
Which is exactly what we are dissecting today on this deep dive. For those of you listening, we are looking at a fascinating, highly detailed blueprint of global development. And when I say blueprint, I mean that in the most literal sense.
Yeah, the format of the stick material is wild.
It really is. It's a meticulously crafted architectural outline for an academic presentation. It's designed to deconstruct the past, present, and future of a very specific group of nations called IDA blend countries.
And defining that term right out of the gate is critical. I mean, for anyone trying to understand the global economy, you have to know what this means.
So what is an IDA blend country?
IDA blend represents a highly specific and honestly a highly precarious transition phase. These are nations that are attempting to move out of the absolute lowest income bracket.
Okay.
Historically, as low-income countries, they've relied on the International Development Association. That's the IDA.
Which provides highly concessional loans, right?
Right. We're talking essentially zero-interest charity loans with massive grace periods. It's the global financial safety net for the poorest nations on Earth.
And the goal, obviously, is to graduate from that safety net. They want to move up to middle income status.
Exactly. And once they do that, they'd start borrowing from the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
But the IBRD operates much more like a traditional creditworthy commercial bank, doesn't it?
It does. It charges closer to market rates, and it absolutely expects a return on its investment.
So think of this blend status as a halfway house. It's the middle child of the global economy.
That's a great way to put it. These countries have grown just enough, they've generated just enough wealth that the international community says, okay, you are getting too wealthy to rely entirely on the most basic global charity.
But structurally, fundamentally, they are still far too fragile to stand completely on their own in the ruthless arena of global financial markets.
They are caught right in the middle.
Caught in the middle. And what dictates whether they actually break through to lasting prosperity or just slide backward down the economic ladder is exactly what we're going to explore.
And I should talk about how this data is presented because it's so specific.
Oh, yeah. What makes this source material so compelling to me isn't just the data itself, but the visual rules the designer was given.
The constraints are intense.
Extremely strict. We are looking at pure, flat white backgrounds. The instructions specifically say hex code FFF. There are absolutely no 3D graphics allowed.
No.
No bright, distracting colors, just stark, dark grays, navy blues, and a tiny touch of dark red for emphasis. It's an unvarnished, clinical look at reality.
Well, it forces a specific kind of honesty, right?
How so?
When you strip away the colorful stock photos of bustling marketplaces or smiling children or whatever, when you remove the flashy chart animations, you're left with just the skeletal structure of these economies.
Right, the presentation literally forbids any heavy figurative images.
Exactly. The minimalist design, just flat trend arrows and simple geometric circles highlighting key data points, it means we have to look directly at the fractures.
Just the fractures and the growth plates exactly as they are.
Yeah. There is no emotional manipulation, just the undeniable weight of the numbers.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Hmm.
Because the very first number we encounter on slide 3 is staggering.
It really sets the stage.
We're looking at a massive area, graph mapping, the total economic output, the constant GDP of these IDA blend countries over the past few decades. And the line just takes off like a rocket.
It's a huge jump.
It goes from a total constant GDP of roughly $122 billion all the way up to $1.4 trillion.
Trillion with a T.
Yeah, that is an exponential curve upward. It is a more than tenfold increase. I mean, on paper, if you just look at that one navy blue mountain of data, you'd think we have completely solved global development.
You'd assume these countries have entirely figured it out, and it is an objective triumph of gross economic generation.
A $1.4 trillion economy is not a small player on the global stage.
No, not at all. But the minimalist design of this blueprint immediately undercuts that celebration.
Right, because of the second axis.
Exactly. Because layered directly over that massive mountain of total GDP is a very flat, very slow-moving secondary line.
And that line represents the per capita GDP, the actual amount of economic output per person.
And this is where the sheer gravity of the situation hits you.
Because while the total GDP ballooned to $1.4 trillion, the per capita GDP only crawled from about $90 up to roughly $2,076.
$2,076 annually per person.
It's an agonizingly slow crawl. And the blueprint visually highlights this divergence. The instructions tell the designer to use a dashed circle around the flat slope of the per capita line.
Yeah, and point a gray arrow to the growing gap between the two lines.
Right. And they label it the scissor effect.
The scissor effect. It perfectly describes the illusion of macroeconomic success masking microeconomic stagnation.
Because the two lines of the scissor are opening wider and wider.
Right. The total wealth is growing exponentially, but the individual lived reality remains squarely in a low-income bracket.
It's like, okay, think about it like this. It reminds me of community deciding to bake a cake for a massive celebration.
Okay, I like this.
They start out years ago with a very modest single-layer cake. Over the decades, they get better resources, more capital, better baking techniques, and eventually they are baking this spectacular, towering 10-tier wedding cake.
A $1.4 trillion cake.
Exactly. Mathematically, the volume of the cake has increased tenfold. It's a massive success. But suddenly, instead of a dozen guests showing up to the party, thousands upon thousands of new guests are pouring through the doors.
Right.
The cake is huge, yes. But when you go to hand out the slices, everyone's individual slice is still paper thin.
Or even smaller than it was before.
Yeah. In fact, because there's so many new people, some people might be getting an even smaller slice than they did when the cake was tiny.
That analogy captures the fundamental tension perfectly, and it begs the immediate question, where are all these new guests coming from?
Right? Why is the population surging so fast that it completely dilutes a $1.4 trillion economy?
What's fascinating here is that the answer lies in the shifting demographic structure of these nations. Specifically, a metric known as the total dependency ratio.
Which is mapped out on slide 4. The blueprint tracks this ratio meticulously, and the trend is massive.
It is.
But before we get into the numbers, let's make sure we clearly define what the total dependency ratio actually measures for everyone listening, because it's kind of the engine driving this entire economic story.
Good point. So the total dependency ratio compares the number of dependents in a society to the working age population.
And dependents are defined as?
They're typically defined as children under the age of 15 and elderly individuals over the age of 64.
Okay.
The working age population is everyone in between from 15 to 64. So this ratio tells you mathematically how many non-working people every single working adult has to support through their labor and taxes.
And the historical data here is brutal. At its peak, the total dependency ratio in these IDA blend countries was at a staggering 92.0%.
Let that number sink in. 92%. For every 100 working age adults, there were 92 dependents.
It is almost a 1-to-1 ratio.
Yeah.
I mean, the sheer physical and psychological strain of that on a household level is hard to fathom. If you have 2 working parents, they are entirely responsible for themselves.
Yeah.
Plus, almost 2 additional dependents, likely multiple young children or aging parents who require constant care.
Right. When almost half of your entire national population is 2 young or too old to generate income. Simply maintaining the status quo just consumes everything.
Just keeping food on the table.
Exactly. It consumes every ounce of energy and capital you have. There is no surplus.
No ability to save money.
No ability to invest in a business, no ability to pay higher taxes to build national infrastructure. The economy is entirely locked in a survival state.
But the data shows a massive systemic shift. Over the decades, that 92.0% dependency ratio has plummeted down to 72.5%.
It's a huge drop.
And the blueprint highlights this on a stacked area chart with a massive downward-pointing red arrow. The text explicitly states that the labor supply potential is being massively released.
Right, the red arrow is key there.
Okay, let me pause you there, though, because my immediate instinct is to view a drop from 92% down to 72.5% as an automatic guaranteed victory.
Which is what most people think.
Well, yeah. Fewer dependents and a massive surge in the number of working-age adults. Isn't that exactly what economists call the demographic dividend?
Right.
We saw this happen in East Asia in the late 20th century, where a booming youth population drove explosive manufacturing growth. If you suddenly have millions of new hands ready to work and fewer mouths to feed per worker, shouldn't that automatically guarantee explosive economic growth?
You would think so.
Why is that per capita GDP still stuck at $2,076 then?
It's the most common trap in economic forecasting.
Assuming that demography equals destiny.
Exactly. Assuming that demography equals destiny. A dropping dependency ratio is not a demographic dividend. It is merely a demographic window of opportunity.
A window, not a guarantee.
A window. The fact that the ratio dropped simply means you have unlocked the door. You have millions of young adults entering the prime of their lives.
The potential for massive economic output is sitting right there.
But whether those hands actually build a modern, high-functioning economy, or whether they just end up standing idle in the streets, depends entirely on a sequence of massive societal prerequisites.
And if those prerequisites aren't met?
Well, if you have 1 million new workers, but they are chronically sick,
Right.
if they have spent 6 years in school but cannot read a basic instruction manual, and if the economy hasn't built any formal factories or offices to actually hire them, then you do not have a demographic dividend.
You have a demographic disaster.
You have a recipe for mass youth unemployment, profound social unrest, and total economic stagnation. The dropping dependency ratio is just the opening act. The real test is what the country does with those workers.
Which perfectly sets up the next section of our deep dive. Because it means we have to look incredibly closely at the actual human beings making up this new labor force.
Right, moving to slide 5.
Exactly. We need to examine their physical foundation. How healthy is this surging working-age population?
Yeah.
Are they physically capable of driving a $1.4 trillion economy forward?
And the data presents a very complex picture of health, but it starts with a moment of undeniable, profound human triumph.
It really does. I was looking at slide 5, and the blueprint uses an X-shaped intersecting line graph to show this. The visual is incredibly striking.
Yeah, it's very stark.
The designer notes call it a two-way rush. One line is shooting rapidly upward, and that represents the life expectancy for the total population.
Which has made this incredible leap from 42.5 years to 62.4 years.
An entire 20 years added to the average human lifespan in these nations.
Yeah.
That is unbelievable.
And the intersecting line plunging sharply downward is the under 5 male mortality rate.
Which dropped from a terrifying 160.6 per thousand down to 77.1 per thousand.
We really have to step outside the flat, clinical lines of this graph for a second to grasp what a mortality rate of 160.6 per thousand actually means to a society.
Yeah, please.
It means that historically, out of every 1,000 boys born, over 160 of them would not survive to see their 5th birthday. That is a mortality rate of over 15%.
It's horrifying. I mean, as a parent, it's unimaginable.
It creates a society steeped in a very specific kind of chronic trauma.
Yeah.
When losing a child is not a rare, unimaginable tragedy, but a statistically common expectation, it changes the entire psychological fabric of a community.
Of course it does.
It changes how people plan for the future. It forces families to have significantly more children just to ensure that a few survive to adulthood to help with the farm or care for the parents in old age.
Which ironically keeps that dependency ratio unsustainably high.
Exact.
So cutting that mortality rate down to 77.1, obviously 77 deaths per thousand is still far higher than anyone in the developed world would tolerate today.
Sure.
But it represents a halving of the death rate. The instruction on the slide says circle the intersection point and label it a victory for basic public health interventions. We're talking about millions of children surviving. It is a monumental victory.
And the catalyst for that victory wasn't some high-tech, trillion-dollar medical breakthrough. No, it was the diligent, widespread application of very basic, highly effective public health interventions.
We're talking about things like clean drinking water initiatives.
Yes, digging safe wells, basic sanitation and sewage management.
Right.
Massive national childhood vaccination campaigns targeting polio, measles, and diphtheria.
And those oral rehydration salts, right?
Exactly. The widespread distribution of oral rehydration salts, which literally cost pennies but save millions of infants from dying of basic diarrheal diseases.
Oh, simple.
These are unglamorous, purely functional, low-cost interventions. But they drove that X-shaped graph. They saved the children, and they extended the average lifespan into the early 60s.
So the foundation of our demographic dividend seems solid. The workforce is surviving childhood, and they are living long enough to put in decades of productive labor.
It looks good on paper.
Right. But just as we think we found a clean success story, the blueprint throws us a massive curveball on slide 6, because living longer fundamentally changes how people get sick.
And ultimately how they interact with the healthcare system.
Right.
This is the epidemiological shift, and it is the hidden tax on extending life expectancy.
The hidden tax. I like that phrasing.
When your population primarily dies before the age of 45, they are generally dying of acute communicable diseases, infectious diseases, maternal and perinatal conditions, and nutritional deficiencies.
Right.
The data on slide 6, which uses a minimalist slope graph, by the way, shows that deaths from these causes have dropped significantly, falling from about 62.0% of all deaths down to 47.4%.
That's the direct result of the vaccines and the clean water we just talked about.
Precisely. But look at the other side of this epidemiological shift. The slope graph tracks a second category of disease, and the line is climbing sharply.
With an upward arrow, yeah.
Deaths from non-communicable diseases, or NCDs. We are talking about cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, chronic respiratory diseases, diabetes, and cancers.
And that percentage has climbed from 31.8% to 44.5%.
Right.
Let me try an analogy here to see if I am grasping the economic weight of this.
Go for it.
Imagine you're running a business with a really old, fragile computer network. For decades, your main IT problem has been very basic hardware failures. The power cords keep getting unplugged, or dust gets into the cooling fans and shorts the motherboards.
Okay.
So you finally invest in a basic upgrade. You buy better power supplies, you clean out the dust, you fix the hardware, and suddenly your computers are running much longer. They are surviving.
The hardware fix works.
Exactly. But because the computers are now running longer, and because they are now connecting to a wider network, you suddenly realize you have an entirely new problem.
Oh, I see where this is going.
You are now being hit with incredibly complex software viruses, ransomware, and deep system malware that you were completely unprepared for.
Right.
And here's the kicker. Your IT department only knows how to clean dust out of fans. They have absolutely no budget, no tools, and no training to fight complex software viruses.
That perfectly illustrates the concept of the double burden of disease that these IDA blend countries are currently being crushed by.
The slide actually has a rectangular box calling it out, the challenge of the double burden of disease.
Yeah, because treating a communicable disease, the hardware issue in your analogy, is often an acute, highly localized, and relatively inexpensive intervention.
Like the mosquito nets.
Exactly. You give someone a mosquito net to prevent malaria. You administer a short course of cheap antibiotics for an infection. You hand out vitamin A supplements.
Stuff that's easy to deploy.
Right. You can deliver these solutions through very basic, rural cinderblock clinics staffed by community health workers with minimal training.
But treating a non-communicable disease,
Mm-hmm.
treating cancer or heart disease, that is a fundamentally different universe of medicine.
It requires an entirely different medical infrastructure. NCDs require chronic, lifelong management.
You don't just give someone a pill and send them home cured.
No. You need MRI machines to detect the tumors. You need specialized oncology wards and highly trained cardiac surgeons. You need perfectly refrigerated, continuous pharmaceutical supply chains for insulin to treat the skyrocketing rates of diabetes.
And these are countries with a per capita GDP of roughly $2,000 a year.
Exactly. They simply do not have the capital to build a Western-style chronic care medical infrastructure.
So they are fighting a brutal two-front war.
They are. They haven't fully eradicated the old infectious diseases. That 47.4% is still a massive burden on the system, but they are simultaneously being overwhelmed by the catastrophic costs of these modern chronic diseases.
The healthcare systems are stretched to the absolute breaking point.
And the economic impact of that is devastating. If we go back to our demographic dividend, all those new workers ready to build the economy, yes, they survived childhood. But if a significant portion of your workforce develops unmanaged diabetes in their 40s or suffers a debilitating stroke at 55 because there was no preventative blood pressure medication available,
their economic productivity drops to zero.
exactly. They leave the workforce and they instantly transition right back into being dependents.
Requiring care from the younger generation.
Yeah.
Which threatens to reverse the very demographic progress they just made.
Exactly. The physical foundation of the workforce is heavily compromised. But physical health is only the first prerequisite.
Right. There's more.
To truly capitalize on a demographic dividend in the modern world, you don't just need healthy bodies. You need highly capable minds.
Which brings us to the human capital data in this blueprint, and what is arguably the most heartbreaking paradox in the entire analysis.
Let's look at slides 7 and 8.
Yeah. We're moving from physical health to mental capital. And just like with the GDP and the life expectancy data, the presentation initially sets us up with what looks like a spectacular victory on slide 7.
It always starts with the good news.
Right. We have a very clean, progressive combination bar chart showing primary school completion rates and youth literacy. And the numbers look fantastic. Primary school completion has risen from 67.3% to 76.3%. More kids are finishing basic schooling than ever before.
And the youth literacy rate, measuring the 15 to 24-year-old bracket, has jumped from 60.6% to almost 80%, specifically 79.6%.
The designer's notes for this section actually include an instruction to draw a dashed threshold line across the top of the chart at the 80% mark.
To emphasize the breakthrough.
Right. It's meant to highlight that these nations are right on the verge of breaking the 80% popularization threshold for literacy. It feels like a massive generational win.
It really does.
It suggests that 4 out of 5 young adults entering this massive new workforce can read and write. It implies they are equipped with the mental tools needed to participate in a $1.4 trillion economy.
It projects an image of absolute readiness.
But then, slide 8 completely flips the perspective.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
The blueprint introduces a concept called learning poverty. And the visual representation of this data point, I mean, it's the most visceral, chilling thing in the entire presentation.
Describe it for the listeners.
Okay, so we are told to imagine a stark white canvas. FFFFFF background. In the center, there are 10 minimalist, human-shaped icons lined up in a row. They represent the children who have just completed primary school. But 8 out of those 10 figures are completely grayed out.
Just turned into shadows.
Visually erased. It represents an immense, catastrophic leakage in human capital. And there's a red box drawn around one of the gray figures.
And the statistic bolded next to those grayed out shadows is devastating. 79.2% of boys at the end of primary school age lack minimum reading proficiency.
Okay, I have to stop and push back on this because these two sets of numbers seem completely contradictory.
They do.
On one side, the data claims that almost 80% of the youth are literate on paper. But on the other side, it claims that almost 80% of boys at the end of primary school lack minimum reading proficiency. How can both of those things be true at the same time? Are we measuring completely different groups of people? Is the literacy data just a complete fabrication?
The data isn't a fabrication, but the historical definition of literacy used in those household surveys is deeply, fundamentally flawed.
How so?
Well, to synthesize these two data points, you have to understand the vast, tragic canyon that exists between basic rote literacy and functional reading comprehension.
Explain the difference.
Yeah.
What happens when a surveyor goes out to measure that 80% literacy rate?
When a household survey is conducted to check the literate box, the test is often incredibly low bar. The surveyor might ask the teenager, "Can you sign your own name?"
Just sign your name.
Yeah. Or they might point to a single, highly familiar word on a piece of paper and ask them to sound it out. If the child can sound out the letters or write their name, they are officially categorized as literate.
Wow.
And to be fair, achieving that across 80% of a population that was previously entirely unlettered is a logistical achievement.
Right. It proves that I actually went to school.
It proves that the government built the cinderblock schoolhouse, the parents sent the child to the building, and the child physically sat in the seat.
Right. It measures attendance and the most basic memorization of the alphabet.
Exactly, but learning poverty measures something entirely different. It measures cognitive utility.
Which means what exactly?
It asks, can an 11-year-old read an age-appropriate paragraph, process the grammar, and actually understand what it means? Can they extract useful information from a short text? Can they apply basic logic to a written scenario?
And the horrifying reality of the data is that almost 80% of them cannot.
They are, to use the academic phrasing, in school but not learning. In school but not learning. So they spent 6 years of their childhood sitting in a crowded classroom. They contributed to that nice 76.3% primary completion rate. The government checked the box. Then they walked out the door without the fundamental cognitive tools needed to actually process new information.
Yeah.
How does a systemic failure of that magnitude happen across entire nations?
It happens when you expand access without expanding quality. You build thousands of schools, but you don't have enough trained teachers, so you end up with 80 kids in a single classroom.
Oh, wow. 80 kids.
Easily.
Yeah.
And the teacher doesn't have time to check for individual comprehension. They just write on the chalkboard and have the class recite it back in unison. It's rote memorization.
Just repeating sounds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Add to that the fact that many of these children are coming to school malnourished, which stunts early cognitive development, and they are returning to homes with absolutely no reading materials. The system is designed to process students, not to educate them.
And the economic consequences of this are terrifying. If we connect this back to the demographic dividend, this massive gap in functional comprehension threatens to turn that entire population boom into a staggering liability.
Absolutely.
Because the modern global economy, even in a transitioning IDA blend country, doesn't just need raw, unskilled physical muscle anymore. We aren't in the 19th century.
Right. Modern economic growth requires critical thinking. It requires a worker who can read an instruction manual on a factory floor, who can understand the terms of an agricultural loan, who can navigate a digital interface, who can problem solve when a machine breaks down.
If 80% of your young men cannot functionally comprehend a basic text, how on earth do they participate in a higher value digital transition?
They don't.
How does a country attract foreign direct investment to build advanced manufacturing plants if the local workforce can't read the safety protocols?
They can't. The governments took on debt to build the schools, the parents sacrificed the potential income of their children's labor to send them to class, but the actual human capital was never accumulated. Those 8 grayed-out figures on the visual are a lost generation.
And this brings us to the inevitable, explosive collision point, which is tracked in the labor market slides, starting on slide 9.
Yeah.
We have established that the dependency ratio has dropped. A massive generation of young people is flooding out of those failing schoolhouses. They are healthier than their grandparents, they are living longer, but 80% of them are suffering from severe learning poverty. What happens when that specific, functionally illiterate generation wakes up on a Monday morning and goes looking for a job?
That is the trillion-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it forces us to examine the macroeconomic structure of employment in these countries.
The blueprint shows a classic structural shift is underway, but it is painfully, dangerously slow.
Yeah, the stacked bar chart on slide 9 shows this.
Historically, as a country develops, you see a mass migration of labor out of subsistence agriculture and into industry and services. You move from the farm to the factory, where productivity is higher, wages are better, and overall economic output scales up.
And the data shows this migration is happening. Employment in agriculture is shrinking. It has dropped from 44.9% down to 36.8%.
Millions of people are leaving the rural farms and migrating toward the urban centers.
But the designer of this blueprint was given an incredibly pointed instruction here.
I saw that. They were told to literally write a question directly onto the slide next to a downward pointing arrow.
Yeah, where is the surplus labor going?
Because if a demographic dividend is functioning correctly, that displaced agricultural labor is seamlessly absorbed into high productivity, formal industrial jobs. Textile manufacturing, assembly plants, light engineering, formal construction.
But slide 10 answers the question, and the answer is incredibly grim.
We have a minimalist donut chart breaking down the labor market, and it shows that wage and salaried workers, which is the category for formal employment, where you have a contract, a boss, regular hours, and a predictable paycheck, that formal sector only grew from 20.8% to 26.6% of the total workforce.
It is barely a quarter of the donut. The formal economy is a tiny, exclusive sliver.
Meanwhile, the massive, overwhelming chunk of that donut chart is categorized as vulnerable employment.
Yeah.
And that number is staggering,
There's a line pointing directly to it.
hovering stubbornly between 61.5% and 68.6%.
Over 60% of the entire labor force is trapped in vulnerable employment. The designer note says to label it the core pain point of lacking social security and stable income.
Let's expand on the skyscraper analogy to visualize this failure. It's like an expanding city decides it desperately needs to modernize. The government tears down all the old, low-yield farming infrastructure on the outskirts of town to build a gleaming new financial district with massive skyscrapers and high-tech factories. The agricultural base shrinks, and millions of farmers are displaced.
Right.
But instead of giving those displaced farmers hard hats, specialized training, and union contracts to actually build and work inside those new skyscrapers, the skyscrapers are only designed to hold about 26% of the population.
And what happens to the massive surplus? What happens to the other 60+% of those displaced people?
They're just left standing in the street outside the skyscrapers. They don't disappear. They still have to eat.
Yeah.
So they start selling trinkets on the sidewalk to the people walking into the skyscrapers.
Yeah.
They wash windshields at the traffic lights. They set up unregulated food stalls. They hustle day to day in the informal shadow economy. They have absolutely zero social safety net. No sick leave, no health insurance, no predictable income, and no legal protections.
That is the precise definition of vulnerable employment. The ILO, the International Labor Organization, categorizes these individuals as own-account workers and contributing family workers.
They're working incredibly hard.
Often much harder physically than the people inside the skyscrapers, but their economic productivity is marginally low. They aren't generating surplus capital, and their economic security is completely non-existent. They are entirely exposed to the elements of the market.
If a shock hits the system, a drought that raises food prices, a global pandemic that shuts down foot traffic, or even just a week of heavy monsoon rains, they have zero buffer.
Right. They don't have savings.
They immediately fall right back into extreme absolute poverty.
And if we tie this devastating labor data back to the learning poverty data we just analyzed, the puzzle pieces snap together perfectly.
It's a closed, vicious loop.
It really is. Why aren't the skyscrapers hiring them? Why isn't the formal sector absorbing this massive labor pool? Because if 80% of your youth lack functional reading comprehension, they cannot be absorbed into a high-productivity formal sector.
A modern textile factory or a digital logistics hub cannot operate with an illiterate workforce.
Exactly. The formal sector is starved for skilled talent. So it stays small at that 26% mark, which forces the massive unskilled youth bulge into the vulnerable street economy by default.
It's a developmental trap. The bad education system fails to produce a talent dividend. That starves the formal sector. The formal sector fails to grow, forcing everyone into the informal street economy. The informal street economy generates almost no tax revenue for the government.
And because the government has no tax revenue, it can't afford to hire better teachers or fix the education system. The cycle just feeds on itself.
It is the defining trap of the IDA blend halfway house. And incredibly, Slide 11 reveals another massive structural flaw in this labor market that makes the situation even worse.
The missing female workforce.
Yeah. If you are a country trapped in this cycle, trying desperately to outgrow your poverty, you need every single ounce of productivity, innovation, and labor you can muster. You need all hands on deck. But the data shows a massive, persistent gender gap that is essentially hobbling the economy. The blueprint uses a back-to-back bar chart comparing male and female labor force participation.
It's a great visual way to show the disparity.
Male participation dropped slightly over the decades, settling around 79%, but the female participation rate is deeply, chronically suppressed. The ratio of female to male participation is just stuck, wandering aimlessly between 60.1% and 70.9%.
There's an instruction to use brackets in the empty space to explicitly point out the gap.
Right, and this is where we have to reframe how we talk about gender equality in the context of macroeconomics.
This raises an important point. We rightly talk about gender equality as a fundamental human rights issue, a social justice imperative, which it absolutely is.
Of course.
But when you are looking at a blueprint for a $1.4 trillion economy trying to achieve sustainable growth, this gap represents a profound, devastating economic hemorrhage.
The designer's notes literally label it an unignorable loss of the gender dividend.
Think about it. Imagine trying to run a grueling marathon, but deciding to tie one of your legs securely behind your back before the starting gunfires.
Right.
If you are effectively leaving 30 to 40% of the productive, intellectual, and entrepreneurial capacity of half your population completely on the sidelines, you are actively sabotaging your own GDP.
And why is that ratio stuck? It ties right back to the beginning of our deep dive. The burden of that shifting demographic dependency.
Exactly. Even as the overall dependency ratio drops, the people who are still dependent, the aging population suffering from those expensive new chronic diseases we talked about, the infants surviving past their 5th birthday, who is overwhelmingly expected to stay home and provide the unpaid, invisible labor of caring for them.
The women.
The women. The lack of institutional childcare, the lack of elder care infrastructure, combined with entrenched cultural barriers and discriminatory property or banking laws, physically prevents women from entering that formal 26% sector.
The result is massive wasted economic potential. It is a self-inflicted wound on the national balance sheet.
So true.
Okay, let's take a breath and synthesize exactly where we are, because the picture is incredibly stark. We have a massive, surging generation of working-age people. They are surviving childhood and living longer, but their healthcare systems are collapsing under the weight of expensive new chronic diseases.
Right.
They have sat in school for 6 years, but 80% of them are functionally illiterate. They are migrating away from rural farms, but instead of finding formal jobs, 60% of them are trapped in a highly vulnerable hand-to-mouth street economy. And millions of women are systematically locked out of the workforce entirely. That is the present reality of the IDA blend halfway house.
It is a fragile, highly combustible foundation, but history doesn't stop.
No, it doesn't.
The global economy is moving forward rapidly, and these nations are desperately trying to find a way to leapfrog over these structural traps, which forces us to look toward the future collision.
Moving to slide 12, what tools are they using to break the cycle, and what invisible chains are still holding them down?
Let's start with the tool. And honestly, amidst all this heavy systemic friction, this next piece of data is the silver bullet that every development economist prays for.
The digital hockey stick.
The visual here is beautiful in its mathematical simplicity. It is a classic, perfectly smooth, exponential curve shooting up and to the right.
We are looking at internet usage. In these IDA blend countries, internet penetration started out at a mere 4.4%. It was essentially non-existent, a luxury reserved for a few elite government offices, major universities, or wealthy urban enclaves. And then, boom,
It explodes upward.
skyrocketing to 41.2%. The instructions say to use a deep gray solid upward arrow to emphasize this exponential digital dividend.
Nearly half of the entire population is now online.
We have to acknowledge what a staggering logistical and infrastructural achievement that is. Think about the physical reality of laying fiber optic cables across mountainous terrain or through dense jungles.
It's massive.
Think about the thousands of cell towers built in areas with unreliable electricity. Think about the massive proliferation of cheap, accessible smartphones that brought the internet out of the internet cafe and into the palm of a street vendor's hand.
41% connectivity is a game changer.
Absolutely.
It means access to global markets. It means a farmer can check real-time weather data and commodity prices instead of being cheated by a middleman. It means the unbanked population can suddenly use mobile money to save and transfer capital.
It feels like the ultimate tool for bypassing all that bad physical infrastructure we just discussed.
It is a massive opportunity, and it provides real, tangible benefits to millions of people. But as we must constantly do with this blueprint, we have to ground the conversation in physical reality.
Okay, slide 13.
Right. Growth. Even frictionless, digital, cloud-based growth does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in the physical world, and it exacts a heavy toll. Which brings us to the ecological footprint of this $1.4 trillion economy.
Right. Building those cell towers, powering the server farms that run the mobile banking networks, and expanding the urban centers requires immense amounts of energy.
And the data shows a stark, unyielding reality. Absolute CO2 emissions in these countries skyrocketed from 122 million metric tons up to over 569 million metric tons.
A nearly 5-fold increase in carbon emissions. Now, I want to be fair to the data here. The blueprint uses a combination chart for this, and the secondary line tracks renewable energy consumption.
Which is surprisingly high.
Yeah, it's sitting between 59% and 61%. So they are heavily utilizing hydroelectric power, solar initiatives, and traditional biomass. It's not just pure coal expansion.
The percentage of renewables is indeed a bright spot, but the designer of this blueprint was given a very specific instruction for the visual. They were told to draw a bright, undeniable warning circle around the top of the absolute CO2 bar chart.
Because percentages don't trap heat in the atmosphere.
Exactly. Absolute volume does, and the absolute volume of emissions is climbing at a completely unsustainable rate. If these countries are going to continue to grow their GDP to try and escape the halfway house, and if they follow the carbon-heavy industrialization path that historical middle-income countries followed, the ecological cost will be devastating.
And that devastation will hit them first.
Oh, without a doubt. In the form of localized air pollution, agricultural collapse from changing weather patterns, and extreme climate vulnerability for those 60% of workers living precariously in the informal economy.
So they have the digital tools to leapfrog, but they are paying a heavy environmental price to power them. And that leads us to slide 14, the final, most sobering piece of data in the entire analysis.
This is the invisible chain that anchors the entire system to the floor, the macro governance and debt trap.
If you want to know why the schools are underfunded, why the healthcare system can't afford oncology wards, and why the infrastructure is lacking, you look at this slide.
The data here is a financial gut punch.
We are looking at a metric called debt service. This isn't the total amount of money they owe. This is just the cash required to pay the recurring interest and the minimum principal on the money they have already borrowed.
And that debt service is eating up roughly 13.9%.
Almost 14% of their total exports and primary income.
Almost 14 cents of every single dollar of hard currency these countries bring in from the global market goes straight back out the door instantly just to service old debt.
It never touches the domestic economy.
It's a massive, continuous hemorrhage of domestic capital. That is the exact capital that is desperately needed to hire trained reading specialists to fix the 79% learning poverty rate.
Right.
It's the money needed to subsidize formal industrial growth to absorb the street vendors, but it's gone.
And the chart instruction says to put a light gray background highlight on anything over 10%, calling it a debt service pressure warning zone. They are well into the warning zone.
And worse, the second chart on the slide measures the institutional capability to manage what little money is left. It's a dashboard measuring the CPIA score.
The Country Policy and Institutional Assessment.
Right. It's an index used by the World Bank to measure the quality of a country's policy framework and institutional strength. Specifically, this dashboard focuses on public sector transparency, accountability, and corruption.
It's graded on a scale of 1 to 6, and the needle on this dashboard is stubbornly, aggressively stuck in the lower half, fluctuating between just 3.0 and 3.4.
It hasn't improved in any meaningful way despite decades of development programs.
What does a 3.0 actually mean on the ground?
A score in the low threes means that the fundamental institutions of the state are weak. It means corruption remains a massive systemic drag on economic efficiency.
Okay.
It means that even when the government does manage to scrape together the capital to build a new road or a new hospital, a significant percentage of those public funds never actually reach their intended target due to graft, mismanagement, or lack of oversight.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here because I want to connect this back to our digital hockey stick on slide 12.
Okay, let's do it.
Can't that exploding internet penetration solve this 3.4 CPIA score? If over 40% of the population is online with smartphones, can't we use e-government initiatives?
Yeah.
Can't we put public procurement contracts on a transparent public blockchain? Can't we use digital transparency portals to completely bypass the old, corrupt, physical gatekeepers, the bureaucrats demanding bribes and force that corruption score up? Isn't technology the ultimate cure for bad governance?
It is a very seductive theory, and it's heavily pushed by Silicon Valley. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the entire interconnected anatomy of this blueprint.
Okay.
Technology is an amplifier. It is a tool. It is not a cure. Yes, you can put government services online. E-government is a powerful concept. But think about the foundational realities we have just spent the last hour meticulously deconstructing. First, there is the fiscal reality. If the foundational debt burden is eating 14% of all expert capital, the government simply lacks the fiscal space to implement massive, secure, nationwide digital infrastructure projects that aren't just superficial websites.
The underlying capital just isn't there to support it.
But more importantly, there is the human reality. Transparency requires an audience capable of processing the information.
The learning poverty.
Exactly. If 80% of your youth are suffering from functional learning poverty, if they cannot comprehend a basic reading comprehension test, how are they going to analyze a complex digital procurement contract?
Wow. Yeah.
How are they going to navigate a convoluted e-government portal to hold their local officials accountable? An internet connection alone cannot magically build a sustainable, transparent democracy. Institutional accountability requires a populace with the cognitive tools to demand it.
And the time to do it.
Right. If your workforce is trapped in the vulnerable street economy, hustling 14 hours a day just to buy enough rice to feed their family, they do not have the physical time, the bandwidth, or the institutional leverage to utilize an e-government app to dismantle entrenched political corruption.
That is a brilliant and honestly devastating connection. Tech amplifies human capacity. But if the baseline human capacity is severely constrained by chronic disease, a total lack of reading comprehension, and extreme hand-to-mouth economic vulnerability, the technology just amplifies the noise.
It doesn't fix the foundation.
A smartphone is an absolute miracle of human engineering, but it cannot cure a mother's diabetes, it cannot teach an 11-year-old to comprehend a textbook, and it certainly cannot sit at a table in Washington or Geneva and renegotiate sovereign debt.
Precisely. The digital tools are necessary, but they are vastly insufficient on their own without the human and structural foundations.
Which brings us to slide 15, the final page of this blueprint, the synthesis of this entire deep dive.
The conclusion.
And interestingly, the presentation ends without any graphs. Yeah. Without any charts. Just pure text organized into 3 minimalist blocks, outlining the academic conclusions and the essential policy prescriptions. How do the architects of this data summarize the path forward for these IDA blend countries?
They distill the survival strategy into 3 core pillars. 3 massive, interconnected, systemic challenges that absolutely must be overcome if these nations are ever going to escape the halfway house.
So what does this all mean? Pillar number 1, they must transform the population dividend into a talent dividend.
Which means treating that 79.2% learning poverty rate as a national emergency.
Right.
If they do not fundamentally overhaul the quality of their education, moving beyond just checking attendance boxes to actually teaching children how to think, process, and comprehend, then that massive surge in working-age population will not be an economic dividend. It will mutate into a massive, highly destabilizing burden of unemployed, unskilled, and frustrated youth.
Pillar number 2. Deepening structural transformation.
They have to build the high-productivity skyscrapers to absorb the displaced farmers. They must create aggressive, targeted industrial and economic policies that foster formal sectors manufacturing, advanced services, agro-processing.
So they can pull that 60+% of their workforce out of the vulnerable, informal street hustle and into stable, taxable, legally protected employment.
And crucially, they have to actively dismantle the barriers keeping women out of that formal sector. They cannot afford to lose the gender dividend.
And finally, pillar number 3, enhancing governance resilience.
They have to confront the invisible chains. They must aggressively manage that suffocating 13.9% debt service, whether through international restructuring, massive export growth, or strict fiscal discipline.
And they must figure out how to utilize that 41% internet penetration to actually force institutional transparency.
Right, break through the entrenched corruption and push that CPIA score out of the low 3s. Because without clean governance, the other 2 pillars will inevitably collapse under the weight of graft, and all of these flow into a final circle on the slide labeled Sustainable, Inclusive Growth.
It is a monumental, almost overwhelming task list. To you, the listener, sitting there right now. We started this deep dive looking at a set of instructions for pure, flat data. White backgrounds, gray lines, symbol arrows.
A visual language completely stripped of emotion, stripped of 3D graphics, stripped of any colorful, distracting photos that might manipulate how we feel.
But what we found beneath that clinical minimalist design is that the flattest, starkest data often reveals the most dramatic, high-stakes human stories on the planet.
We are talking about the survival of infants. We are talking about the silent struggle of an 11-year-old staring at a chalkboard they can't understand.
We are talking about the physical exhaustion of a street vendor who has no safety net, and the quiet systemic suffocation of national debt.
It's the lived reality of hundreds of millions of people mapped out on a cold geometric grid.
And as we wrap up this analysis, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something that the weight of all this interconnected data heavily implies, but leaves unspoken.
What's that?
Well, we've established that IDA blend status is officially defined by the global financial system as a transitional halfway house, a temporary stepping stone from the poorest classification of nations into the stable middle-income world.
Right.
But when you look at the entire anatomy at once, when you look at the crushing, recurring weight of their debt servicing, combined with the creeping, expensive burden of complex chronic diseases, and above all, that massive generational anchor of an 80% learning poverty rate among the youth, we have to ask a much darker structural question.
Is this blend status truly a temporary stepping stone to prosperity?
Or have we inadvertently created a new kind of permanent purgatory?
Wow. A persistent state where a country is just rich enough on paper, just developed enough to be cut off from total global charity, but structurally, fundamentally too fragile, too burdened by debt, informal labor, and educational deficits to ever survive and thrive on its own in the ruthless modern global market.
Are they trapped in the middle permanently?
Yes.
It's a profound, unsettling question to carry with you.
The numbers on the blueprint give us the outline of the trap. But the future of the global economy will be decided entirely by how or if these nations can answer that question and break the cycle.
At the top of the show, we talked about medical diagnoses, how we naturally crave the comfort of a clean x-ray, a broken bone, a simple cast. What we found today in this blueprint of the IDA blend countries is the exact opposite.
It is a murky, deeply interconnected landscape of human capital, invisible debt, and fragile markets.
There is no simple cast to fix it. But by stripping away the noise, removing the colorful distractions, and forcing ourselves to look at the stark, unvarnished data, we at least finally know exactly where it hurts. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the data, keep looking for the human story beneath the numbers, and we'll see you next time.